Hi. So chances are you guys are city dwellers, like about, say, 80% of Canada and about 50% of the rest of the world. And the thing is, cities change things. Cities change themselves and cities change who you are. And the shared experiences that we all have in cities are fundamentally changing the way that we live our lives and the kind of people that we become. We become different because there's so many of us, and the density that we're experiencing in our day-to-day is just so great. And there's so much diversity around us. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is how this is being, our capacity to invent ourselves and become new people is being inadvertently, and I think somewhat well-meaningly, destroyed. And a somewhat obvious comment, the urban it's about people. Jane Jacobs talks about this idea of eyes on the street as being a kind of mutual oversight made possible through density and very active and generally mixed-use communities. It's like an unconscious distribution of responsibility within dense spaces and amongst groups that are, generally familiar with each other, but where strangers walk through. And I mean, you have a choice of whether you're going to be a stranger in a community or make your roots there and become part of that community, where you are sort of protecting it and watching over the strangers, but still welcoming them at the same time. It's about anonymity and sort of being yourself. However, we're now about 30 years of being under mass surveillance within the city. It's just part of the makeup, and it's one of the things that makes the city a city. Cameras are almost like urban furniture at this point. They sort of mark boundaries and they delineate space, and they make spaces sort of more firm and less abstract because we know how to react to the camera. The problem is that these cameras and this furniture, they're shifting from being a sort of passive or benign force to being an active and very invisible one. So a little bit about me and my lens on all of this. I'm a designer and technologist, but I studied political science and policy in university. And during that period, I interned with a government body that was actively involved in selling biometric information to private third parties. And this made possible things like toll roads or police raids. And I felt really weird about all of this, but it was really interesting. And privacy commissioner is really cool. And since I've had experience working with an e-learning startup, I worked on a geolocative game. I've done a lot of sort of large-scale interactive media, and then like a mobile application that sort of studies meaningful lives. But it's always about finding that right interface between the invisible and the things that we can observe or the real. And I think right now what we're seeing is a shift towards media architecture and responsive environments, and these environments and spaces that can recognize who we are, how we act, and what we do. But these things are becoming increasingly non-intuitive and non-observable. The data collection and interpretation are becoming decoupled. So we might have a camera that might have facial recognition or be able to record, and we can react to that camera as a camera, but the servers that are analyzing the data might be streets or miles or continents away. And we're unable to react to the owners of the camera, to the software that the camera might be running, to the database that it might be keeping or feeding, or to the vendors that are employed by the different institutions that own the camera. And I think the human quality of cities as a consequence is being really pushed aside. We're no longer equipped with the tools that we need to really navigate or interpret the environment that we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. There's too many loose threads to keep track of, and so many of those threads are just, we can't observe it with our senses. And it's this sort of question, how can you have street smarts when you can't even see the streets or the things that are defining and starting to really make what the city is. This is a rendering by the architect Dan Hill of the wireless network that's extruding from a library in Queensland. And what does the library actually do when its knowledge network extends outside of the physical bounds that it's supposed to be represented by? So what happens when the environment can read you back? I think we're being tricked into dismissing a lot of this invisible infrastructure as magic. I mean, this capacity to order and structure cities is beginning to undermine the city's ability to evolve new and unexpected things, for us to have kind of emergent qualities in cities that are like this beautiful result of complexity. And we devalue it specifically because we're having difficulty understanding it and mapping it and understanding where those boundaries are. It's kind of like the emperor's new clothes, where you can't really see them, but we're all agreeing that we're beautiful, or they're beautiful, that just, you know, because that's what you do, right? That's what everybody else is doing. So I'm going to tell you a little story about a map. William Smith was a surveyor during the Industrial Revolution, or during that whole period. And he was called on to survey different coal mines during that period. So new mines were being dug everywhere in order to fuel the city's need for like new energy and this resource that the earth had laid bare. And as a consequence of his exposure through these different business interests, he was able to see the patterns of the earth. And he began to bring all those patterns together, and he created this map that told us a lot about the structure of the world, and it had a major contribution to natural philosophy. And he was specifically able to kind of piggyback this discovery on top of business interests. And we all benefit from it. And the thing is, like, businesses are really good at making money and finding opportunities and fulfilling needs, and this is a good thing. And you can sort of interpret a business as being something that's trying to survive and trying to thrive in a particular environment. And there's no evil, really, in any of this. It's about markets and motivation and the sort of weird stuff that, like, the emperor gets caught into. But today, the resource in question is human behavior and human data, and our sort of unprecedented capacity to collect, organize, analyze, and in some cases predict this data en masse. We've all seen stuff like crowdsourced applications and similar, and like increasingly, these things are being embodied in the infrastructure that surrounds us on a day-to-day basis. And these tools and systems are mining our habits. So on one end, we're being provided these incredibly useful services that like we are actively using in our public and in our pockets. Tools like Waze, for example, let us share traffic information back and forth. Amazon's Kindle has a WhisperSync service, which lets us aggregate knowledge and get a better understanding of like the gist or the topic of a book. But like any kind of mining operation, you can't extract resources from something without having an impact on the environment or an impact on the space that you're trying to pull from. So, I mean, if you're digging holes or you're like drilling mines or whatever the hell you do, you're going to leave a mark. And I think this mark is becoming evident in the sort of feedback loop that we're getting between databases, the applications that are feeding them, and then our behaviors that are kind of caught in this trap between the two. An author, Ellie Parsier, talks about this idea of the filter bubble, where we're being fed the information that supports our existing worldviews. And I think we're seeing this increasingly with things like gamification and this kind of like applied game theory, where, I mean, like, to extend the mining analogy, that's like fracking for the human soul. It's creepy as hell because we're breaking apart who we are to just get at this like base level resource that is deep within us, and it's scary. It's really scary. And the thing is, like, applications we can choose to use, but this stuff is beginning to invade our physical space. We're losing our choices. I mean, you look at a tool like Intel's AIM suite. This thing provides anonymous analytics about public space and about audiences. So you can walk through and they'll recognize you and they can say like, oh, okay, that's a guy, that's a girl, this is a possible age range, whatever. But I mean, what if you tie that with, say, targeted advertising? Really look at the demographic data and just feed what is most like, or that person is most likely to enjoy. We're losing this anonymity that we have, and with anonymity comes the capacity to take risks and potentially become more than who we are. We're losing the city as a place of personal reinvention, and we're never going to be anonymous again. And we won't even be able to escape ourselves. Like, there will be no Journey song, you know? No small town girl. She'll stay in the small town. But cities are awesome. And I love living in cities. And like, small towns are cool, and important, but you know. And there's lots of people studying this stuff and different sides of it and taking different lenses to it. Mark Shepard is doing some really cool work with this idea of the sentient city, and he had an exhibit in 2009, which a book has also come out. Adam Greenfield is doing a lot of interesting work around networked urbanism, and I think he's releasing a book soon. There's conferences like Cognitive Cities and Media Cities that are fascinating. IBM is they're going to be selling you the smart city like no tomorrow, so keep an eye open for that. It's really interesting stuff, but it's weird. Like, everybody's talking about these different parts of a bigger picture, which is just cities, and I kind of want to understand it too. So I started this project right now called WhyCities, and it's a walking, talking, camera and binocular wielding, sort of loosely guided discussion group where we wander around and we look at cities and we look at the infrastructure, and we share anecdotes, and we just talk and learn from each other. And it's really inspired by some of those guys like Shepard and Greenfield, but particularly an artist named Aaron Bartal, who pushes forward this idea of a speed project where you get up and you do stuff. And this, for me, is a way of engaging with the city in a way that I haven't before necessarily, which is like a very active, very upfront, and more eyes open, awake way. But there's lots and lots of different ways to do this. Timo Arnell has this awesome project called Immaterials, where like he's essentially trying to make the invisible visible. And he's creating objects and making things to ask questions. So, I mean, that red, or the LED stuff you see there, it's just a stick that they're taking in front of a long exposure shot. And it's responding to the strength of wireless networks in that particular space. And it allows them to construct or reveal topologies or structures that we can't see with our eyes. And it's allowing them to answer and ask questions that we wouldn't necessarily be able to ask before. But also importantly, they're making it visually appealing, and they're able to communicate the things that they discover very broadly. Like, this work is beautiful. This is Adam Harvey's CV Dazzle project, which was a thesis, one of the thesis projects at ITP, where like a lot of really cool work is coming out of there. And he did a really, really in-depth look at how contemporary facial recognition works, specifically using a technique called the Viola-Jones method. I do a lot of work with computer vision, so stuff is very familiar. But like he did this deep dive into it. And from that, he was able to create these new forms and new shapes, and based off of a very deep understanding of the technology that is pervasive, but it's difficult to wrap your head around because it doesn't think like us, it doesn't look like us. And in this case, like you see, like he makes to understand, and it's a very effective way to get a deep understanding of things. But really, like, you'll find your own way to explore. In my case, a couple of years ago, I started a project called City Lenses, which is a sort of walking and running group, not exactly at the same time, but pretty close. I would sort of give people a book to read, and then 2 weeks later, we would go on a run based off of that book, and generally talk about it while having trouble breathing, because, you know. But I mean, this project taught me that like I had control over how I chose to experience the city, and how I chose to see the city. Like you can exercise control in these spaces, and also just like be active about your inputs, and sort of keep your ear to the ground, because like all this diversity, all this complexity is there, and it remains there, but it's becoming more hidden. It's becoming less defined in a way. I recently did an informal survey of a bunch of people just asking like why why did they come to the city? And where were they 5 years ago? And almost everybody talked about this idea of becoming more than they were. They were looking for opportunity, they were looking for education, or they just wanted to be away from wherever they happened to be before. And the city, in our minds, I think, collectively, is this place of metamorphosis and change and a catalyst for being that person that's like hiding out inside of us, but that we can't quite realize elsewhere. And then share what you find. Because nobody's really an expert in any of this. You can be an expert on a facet, or you can sort of develop expertise by looking at like these particular lenses. But I mean, really, we all benefit by doing your exploration and then writing about it, teaching a workshop about it, giving a talk about it, creating public artwork about it, or arguing on the internet about it. Like this project by James Bridle is unreal. It's called Under the Shadow of the Drone, and it's a stencil, like life-size stencil of drones that are flying around in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And it makes it personal, it makes it immediate, uncomfortable, and very context sensitive, which I think it's important for cities. And just, yeah, realize you're in control. We need to out the invisible. We need to be like tracing where those networks start or where they end. We need to turn our questions into physical or social things that demand response. And we need to act now because we're the next oil, we're the next coal, and we're like our ability to rebel and become new is going to be the next scarcity. So, thanks.